as part of the celebration of the career of Erwin Schrödinger and the time that he spent at the Dublin Institute from 1938 to 1955. Each of the component schools of the Institute was asked to participate. But as you can imagine, it was initially quite difficult for me to think how the School of Celtic Studies could really respond in a relevant way to the work of one of the world's great scientists. And eventually, I came to the conclusion that I was just going to have to give our point of view about what scholarship is and why we are here, together with a little bit of the kind of work, a little taste of the kind of work that we do, and not try to do anything cleverer than that with the challenge. And if nothing else, here at least was a chance to set out something of what we do as a branch of the humanities, how it differs maybe from research in the natural sciences. Schrödinger himself, I suspect, would have found the job rather easier than I did. As I wrote this lecture, I did in fact read Schrödinger's short but brilliant work, What is Life?, after which the lecture series was named. An extraordinary little book, and mostly quite followable even by someone with no knowledge of the subject, such as myself. And it was obvious from that book that Schrödinger himself had deep religious, literary, and philosophical interests as well, and that he at least could see all knowledge as a single endeavor. Now, as I look back over the lecture now, it's just over a year, it's a year and a month later. Obviously, our circumstances have changed in ways we could not have imagined in April 2019. I might well ask now not what humanities can say to science, but whether any of us have anything to contribute while we live in such difficult circumstances. Perhaps in the early days of this lockdown, it would have been difficult to give a lecture of this kind when everybody really had other things on their mind. Now I hope at least some people have had a chance to settle, and I am aware, however, that people have suffered losses, are fearful for the future, and they may not have time or inclination to pay much attention to our subject, or anybody else's for that matter. And they need to be allowed space and time for their own concerns. But as I look at the world now, I am not actually fearful that research in the humanities is irrelevant. Quite the contrary, really. I think we need it more than ever. Our central concern, which I would argue is language, use and abuse of language. In this era of the internet, we are inundated with language, and the effects can be seen for good and ill in how the world is dealing with the current crisis and how it is not dealing with it, and the even larger environmental crisis of which this is, in fact, I would argue, a part. I'll come back to this at the end, but now I think it's time for me to return to my original script, the script from April the 4th last year. So, what are we commemorating? I think it is the achievement of bringing two different branches of knowledge together and into a dialogue. Because that is what Erwin Schrödinger achieved in 1943. He brought particle physics, his own field, into a dialogue with genetics. The result was a masterpiece, but we can well understand if Schrödinger felt that he was being bold, maybe even presumptuous, and he did feel that. In fact, he apologizes for relying on what he calls second-hand and incomplete knowledge of the biological half of his subject. So would it be any easier today to achieve what Schrödinger achieved? Would it be more difficult? I suspect more difficult. There have now been a further 80-odd years of research and discovery in each subject. And if it is hard for branches of the natural sciences to talk to each other, how about the humanities? How on earth do they, or we, contribute? Days are long gone when one person could aspire to Schrödinger's ideal of unified, all-embracing knowledge. Let's just consider the pioneer of our particular area of study, Celtic Studies, and that is Edward Llwyd. Edward Llwyd was an extraordinary polymath by any measure. His Archaeologia Britannica, published in 1707, which the title page is on the screen for you, contains the first proper description of the Celtic languages taken together. And Llwyd was a pioneer also in using a phonetic alphabet and in doing actual linguistic fieldwork. He travelled to Ireland, to the Scottish Highlands, to Cornwall, the Isle of Man and Brittany, as well as his native Wales, of course, to collect his material. And in recognition of that fact, you can see on the screen a monument erected to Edward Llwyd in Aberystwyth, outside the Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies, which for Celtic Studies works in a comparable way to the Dublin Institute. It is a dedicated research institute. And quite rightly, they've chosen Edward Llwyd as their quasi-receptionist, as it were. Now, in his own day, however, Llwyd was equally famous as an archaeologist, a botanist, a student of fossils, and he was the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. If Llwyd had lived longer, he would have continued the Archaeologia Britannica to include antiquities and natural history. Now, fast forward now to 2019, 2020, as we are now, and the world of scholarship and science is very different. Unified knowledge has shattered in 1,000 different directions. Let's leave aside Edward Llwyd's interest in the world of nature, but even his field of antiquities has spun off. It has become history, it has become archaeology, art history. In the early 20th century, modern linguistics broke away from traditional text-based philology, and linguistics since then has, in its turn, splintered into more disciplines and subdisciplines than I can possibly say today. Among all this luxuriant growth, then, Celtic Studies is a very small branch of the tree of knowledge. And we employ only a tiny number of productive workers worldwide, certainly in comparison to other, better resourced fields. But even so, nowadays, it is genuinely very difficult to keep up with the flow of new research, even for us. Indeed, it is so difficult that I don't think now that anybody who is starting out, say in 2019 or 2020, is ever really likely to be doing top-level research in both Irish and Welsh, as the pioneers were able to do. There is just too much to know. There's just too much to read, too much to assimilate before you can dare to open your mouth and be confident of saying something that is genuinely worthwhile and new. So even we then are becoming more and more specialized. We might specialize in early Irish law, medieval Welsh poetry, contemporary spoken dialects of Irish or Scottish Gaelic, or any number of other potential subjects. So, when I was asked to write a lecture entitled, "What is Life?" my general inclination was to run away as fast as possible in the opposite direction. This is not the comfort zone that I'm used to. But I suppose it is a good thing to be challenged, to be asked, I suppose occasionally, hopefully very occasionally, to think big, or at least to think a bit bigger than I usually do. So let us think then about what this question means for somebody working in a small but reasonably long established branch of the humanities. My own response will be conditioned by the kind of work that I do. I can't speak for everyone, even if I wanted to, so it's very much an individual perspective. I or we do not study the physical or chemical or atomic processes of life. The events in space and time, in Schrödinger's words, that were of interest to him. Neither our material nor our methods give us access to those processes. What we study is how human beings interact with those processes and how human beings seek in some fashion to understand and manage them, however inadequately. Now, if I were an archaeologist, I might leave the definition there. But for most people in the humanities, the definition is not complete because it fails to mention the crucial dimension of language. We work with words. Arguably, that puts us a stage further distance from natural processes, the stage of language. We study then what human beings have said about the world, their place, what they have said about their place within the processes of life. It's a dramatic narrowing down of focus. It's narrow because only a part of human existence is mediated through language, and narrower still because so very little of the language that we produce endures. Even the very small proportion of human utterance that has been preserved in writing is appallingly fragile and easily lost. Now, of course, the sum total of human utterances recorded in writing, or nowadays in other media as well, is not a small target for research.
Oh, what's to bury?
I can't.
Even the parts of it expressed through the medium of Celtic languages are much more than can be read in a single lifetime. But still, it is a tiny proportion of the past activities of this planet. Now, language and literature are not outside of nature. They're not, that is to say, actually outside the proper sphere of the natural sciences. We are animals. We are no freer than any other animal from natural processes, including evolution, something which we are now perhaps more painfully aware of than previously. Our languages are a product of evolution. They are built out of the stuff of the natural world, ultimately electrical impulses in our brains. Homer's Iliad, then, is a product of nature as much as, say, a magpie's nest. The distinction between what is natural and what is artificial or man-made is not a real distinction. However much we find that we need it in our actual lives, a theory of everything might one day explain both the verbal system of Homer and his Iliad. But we are nowhere near that point. I'm not sure we'll ever reach it. Even the most scientific approaches to language, such as syntactic theory, work to remove from physical reality. Terms like noun or verb or subjunctive are really metaphors for something whose physical existence we cannot as yet penetrate. When we analyze a piece of language as a syntactic tree, and when I say we analyze, I mean other people analyze. This is definitely not my own personal subject, but here is an example of this kind of work. We make assumptions here that these theoretical elements, which you see on the screen, noun, phrase, and so on, are encoded somewhere in our brains, but we can grasp only the output, that is, speech or writing. So we are confined within the prison house of language, to borrow a term. We look at the processes of life only obliquely through language and through layers of human interpretation. We read what people have chosen to say and what various forces of attrition have left behind. So not what is life then, but what people have thought about life, what they've said about life, how they have conceptualized it. That, as far as I can see, is the business of the humanities, from my perspective, as a text-oriented student of medieval literature, at least. So let's move on now to something a little more concrete. And for the rest of my time today, I'll consider the vocabulary and ideas of life in earlier Irish and Welsh. And a starting point is provided by the individual words, because they can tell us something about ideas and ways of dividing up the experience. Now, Irish and Welsh have various words that cover the semantic range of life, living, and so on. The basic Irish word is Old Irish beo, One Irish bio, the adjective for alive. And from this word was formed the general word for life, which is betho in Old Irish and is now pronounced bacha. The Welsh equivalents are bio and boet. And these are cognates. Now, by cognates, I mean that they are inherited from a common ancestor. They're not borrowed from one language to another. They are both inherited from a common ancestor, which we call Common Celtic. Sister words, that is, that come from a single parent. The implication of that view for the physical world is that these words existed at some point in the distant past in that older Common Celtic language. Now, I won't go into technicalities here, but you can see from the forms I've marked on the screen, these are the bottom row on the screen, the ones marked with asterisks. These are the forms that we postulate for the Common Celtic language. And as you can see, they have undergone considerable change over the centuries. It is the techniques of linguistic reconstruction that allow us to reconstruct proto-forms. And by the way, the diagram on the screen is massively simplified, and the amount of information required to produce the reconstructed forms is vast. But the forms, for what they're worth, are on the screen. They are for the adjective biwas, the approximate pronunciation of what you're looking at there, and for the noun biwa tuts. The asterisk is a standard notation in historical linguistics for a reconstructed form. That is a form that is not attested in any actual text. In the nature of things, we cannot be entirely satisfied with our reconstructions, but it is a reasonable postulation that if you could be parachuted back into time and met a Common Celtic speaker and said biwas and biwa tuts, he or she would at least have understood what word you were trying to say. Now, as a matter of fact, the words beo and beo can be traced even further back. They have cognates in other European languages, Latin vivus, ancient Greek bios, and English quick. The earlier meaning of quick in English was alive, as in the quick of your nails, or quicksilver, word for mercury, so it moves around. Russian живой, and so on. And by adding these cognates, we can go back even beyond the Celtic period to the ancestor language that lies behind most Indo-European languages, most European languages and many languages in Asia. And this is what we call Proto-Indo-European. Now, this takes us back, and this is controversial, but I think the best estimate is it's approximately 6,000 years to circa 4,000 BC. That's the likeliest theory, at any rate, for the period when Proto-Indo-European was spoken, somewhere in the Eurasian steppe. And the word we reconstruct for that language was wiwas. Beyond that, however, we cannot go. And the same is true for all the rest of Proto-Indo-European. That's a very negative, categorically negative statement. I will try to justify it, though. It would be wonderful to be able to link Proto-Indo-European with all the other proto-languages that we have reconstructed. The ancestors of Finno-Ugrian languages, Caucasian languages, the Semitic languages. It is quite likely that they were related, I'm quite prepared to believe that they were, but we cannot in fact tell. Why can we not do so? It is because we are bound to the evidence of writing. Writing was invented very late in human history. Reconstruction allows us to push back a certain amount of time before writing, but it is not more than a few millennia. And once you stray too far from the horizon of the oldest written records, there comes a point at which linguistic construction fails. Languages change all the time, and as they change, so the evidence for their older history gets worn away. Eventually, it's worn away to nothing. If I borrow an image from geology, a layer of rock that rises out of the sea is exposed to the elements and gets worn down. If all of it gets worn down before seismic changes move that layer back somewhere where deposition can begin again, then there will be no evidence of that layer ever having existed. But all features of language are exposed to the elements all the time, and they're being eroded all the time. And in language, erosion and deposition happen simultaneously. Words fall out of use, words get replaced, sounds change. And from the layers back beyond Proto-Indo-European, there just isn't enough evidence left. It is not a failing in our methodology. It is an intrinsic constraint imposed by the continuous erosion of evidence over time. So unlike archaeology and unlike geology, historical linguistics is stuck with a shallow time depth. Now, 4000 BC or so is not too bad. It's the beginning of the Metal Age. It's quite a respectable distance to be able to look back. But it gets us nowhere near the origin of language. One thing I must make clear is that Proto-Indo-European is a perfectly ordinary human language. The term proto can be misleading for people outside of historical linguistics. It does not mean primitive. It simply means that Indo-European is the ancestor of attested languages. But it was certainly not primitive. It was not underdeveloped in any way. It was comparable in structure to any of the languages spoken today on the planet. And so in those terms, going back to Proto-Indo-European brings us precisely nowhere near at all to the origins of language. And that is a question, perhaps surprisingly, that is more or less outside the purview, certainly of traditional historical linguistics. Let's do what we can do then and return to the attested material, Irish bio and Welsh byw, that go back to this Indo-European word gwywas, a word that was used by probably a horse riding people or peoples in what is now Ukraine or Kazakhstan, sometime in the early metal era. Strictly speaking, we cannot know what the word gwywas meant to them, and this is because we have no written record of their language, and so no examples of the word in context. And of course, the word means alive in all the daughter languages, so we don't need to be too conscience-stricken in accepting that it meant alive to them as well. But there are plenty of other words where that is a major problem. That is, where the daughter languages have or do not agree at all on the meaning. There is, for instance, a very large and controversial scholarly literature on Indo-European trees and Indo-European fish. And this is because people recycle words for animals and plants when they move into a new area, and they give them to different species. This bird is a robin, but only if you live in North America. It's important then to understand the principle that etymology does not tell you the meaning of a word. Only seeing the word in context in a living language, or the records of a living language, will tell you what it means. So if we look at Irish beo and betho in context, we find that they cover quite a range of meanings. Betho covers the state of being alive, the period of life, one's lifespan. Welsh bywyd is similar in its meanings. Again, being alive as opposed to being dead. The period of life, a lifespan. Interestingly, both words could also mean sustenance or livelihood, and even property in the sense of what you earn your keep from. The transfer of meaning, of course, from life to means of sustaining life is a natural, easy transition to make. And the Irish word has gone even further. Bacha is quite widely used to mean food. And from the examples in the online dictionary of the Irish language, it would appear that that possibility goes all the way back to the Old Irish period, 8th or 9th centuries. So what about more specialized words for life? Irish Sail, the Old Irish pronunciation would have been sail, modern Irish seal or sail, depending on your dialect. This word is a borrowed word. It has been taken from a different language. It has been taken from Latin. Latin word cyclum. So it's a relative newcomer to the Irish language. But by relative newcomer, I mean it's probably borrowed in the 5th century or so, the time of conversion to Christianity. Now, Latin cyclum has a range of meanings: a generation, a race or a breed of beings, a lifetime, a period, an age, the particular times that we live in, and a century, a period of 100 years. And it acquired important meanings in Christian Latin. It came to mean this world, the one we live in, as opposed to eternal life. And so, no doubt, the word entered the Irish language as Irish people grappled with the thought world of the new religion they were learning from St. Patrick and others at the time. A thought world that dictated that from now on, this world is supposed to be a negative place, a place of exile from the true home of the Christian, which is heaven. Now, there's a quasi-equivalent to this word in Welsh, and it is hoidl. I say quasi-equivalent because unlike soil, is in fact native to Welsh, but it comes from the same Indo-European root as the Latin word. And it's a reminder of how complex linguistic history can be. The same Indo-European root can pass down natively through Celtic to Welsh, but not make it into Irish. And then Irish can borrow it from a different Indo-European language, Latin in this case. Now, as hoidl was not in fact borrowed, it seems to have a rather narrower range of meanings than the Irish soil. It just means lifespan and time spent alive. Welsh example, hoidl hir a roddir I rai gwirion. This is one of the examples given on the screen now under 1346. The innocent receive long life. Hoidl hir, long life. Okay, the next word then is ice. Oh, sorry, that's a little diagram showing you the derivation of these two words. So the Indo-European reconstruction at the top there, the derivation into Welsh, the Latin, and then the Irish borrowing of Latin. Okay, the next word is ice, in Old Irish, modern Irish, ish. Age is the primary meaning of this word, and so stage of life, and then retrospectively, one's lifetime. An example is an Old Irish example on the screen for you from the Milan glosses on Psalm 54. Okay. An ice ril yellowodd doif o Christian o gorip ni rushid alieth adye. Okay, so talking about evildoers in the Psalms who will be cut down before their times. The time, of course, in biblical terms is 70 years, 3 score years and 10. The lifetime that was fashioned for them when their bodies were created, they will not attain even half of it. Then in Welsh, there's a cognate, an equivalent word, and it's pronounced oes, O-E-S. The meanings are very similar indeed. And I've given you an example there from the Welsh Life of St. David, 14th century text, talking about St. David's mother, the holy St. Non. Ni manawdd hi fwyd na mynd bara a dwfwr yn ei hoes in her life, in her lifetime, when she lived. Now, Welsh, in fact, has rather more words for life than Irish. There is a derivative of oes, ein oes, which covers much the same meanings as bywyd. I think they should be on the screen, are they? Yes, they are. Ein oes, then, much wider than oes, covers the meaning state of being alive and one's time alive. So the meanings of bywyd and oes, really. Example there from a translation of an Anglo-Norman romance, O'r caffaf iechyd ag ein oes, if I receive health and life. And the second example is from a 16th century poet, William Llŷn. Ni all da'r byd enid awr, estyn ein oes dyn in awr. All the wealth of the world now cannot extend the life of man for a single hour. Ein oes does seem to be limited to humans, but apart from that, it is quite unclear if there's any real difference between ein oes and bywyd. Now, when I speak Welsh today, I only use bywyd, really. Ein oes is really a word confined to literary written Welsh. But what the difference was in the past remains to be determined. Now, another Welsh word is bichedd. Bichedd. Again, has no Irish equivalent, but its close meaning is way of life, or conduct, a way of behaving. An example there from a body and soul debate, 12th century poem. Cyfoethog ddew a fedd y dyn yn ei ddehau fichedd. So a mighty God rules over man in his righteous life or righteous behavior, as you wish. Another piece of religious warning, this time from the 13th century poet, Griffith of Brynner Coch. Edrych, excuse me, edrych dy fichedd cyn myned ith fedd. Excellent advice there. Consider your way of behavior, consider your way of life before you go to the grave. But bichedd seems to extend at times into the wider meanings of life as well. Example comes from the Welsh translation of the Imago Mundi, which is a geographical tract. Awyr o'r hwn ac yn heled bichedd pawb o'r creaduriaid. The air from which the life of every creature is sustained. So here, bichedd translates Latin vitalis spiritus, vital spirit. And bichedd also refers to eternal life. In medieval Welsh, the tree of life, the cross of Christ, that is pren y fichedd, and so on. Example on the screen, a translation of another 12th century tract, a 12th century religious tract. Ar hwn a fwytaau o bren y fichedd, ni chlefychau fyth, ag ni byddai farw fyth. Now, the word bichedd is a bit of a mystery. We don't really understand its etymology, but it looks very much as if it's somehow connected with byw. But the precise formulation eludes us, I'm afraid. Now, another very interesting word is Irish animum. Modern Irish annum, often it's translated as soul. It's extremely like the Latin word anima, as you can see from the forms I've put on the screen, but it is in fact native to the Irish language. There are convincing linguistic reasons why anima in Latin cannot give animum in Irish, but I won't bother you with them today. It is a native Indo-European word, in other words, that happens to have come down through into Irish and into Latin, and to still look relatively the same in both. The Welsh word enaid, which means soul, is related, but it has a rather different format. The second half of the word is clearly based on a different suffix. But just to add complexity, Cornish and Breton, which are close relations of Welsh and not close relations in Irish, have enef and enef, which look as if they're closer to the Irish word. It is conceivable, however, that the Cornish and Breton ones are in fact borrowed from Latin. At any rate, leaving aside the technicalities, in all these words we have the same root, which is an, and it meant breath or breathe. The oldest meaning of this word must have been breath, and from there derived, quite understandably, the meanings life, vital force, and finally, the current religious meaning of soul. Now, the catch-all words for life, which as I said at the beginning were bethu and bywyd, could be used for vital force and for being alive. But the particular word for this was, in early Welsh and early Irish, was anim and enaid. In the Irish example on the screen here from the Tyne, you see Cullen the smith lamenting the death of his guard dog at the hands of Cuchulainn. Con agiaf aniach agus annamin, there's the word, annamin dalsa, in fer wintira rugad oin edon mochu. The member of my household who has been taken from me has protected my honour and my life up till now, my hound. Now, turning to the Welsh version of the word, the Welsh Law Trance. We find here an interesting discussion of a legal question, but in fact a very painful and very difficult question of the kind that legal systems do have to deal with. The scenario in this part of the laws is an offence committed against a pregnant woman, and she has been abused, and violently abused, in fact, and as a result, she has lost her child. The lawyer's question then is what compensation is paid. Now, I should explain that in early Irish and Welsh law, offences were regularly dealt with by means of compensation. So what compensation should be paid? Should it be the woman's honour price, that is, the value attached to that particular woman? Or should the money be, in fact, the standard fine compensation for murder? Is this murder, basically, is the question. Is the fetus a living human being or part of the mother? The law says that killing the fetus is murder, and therefore the price of homicide must be paid. But then it moves on to even more difficult parts of the question. What about the different stages of pregnancy? And the lawyers come up with 3 stages. The first, when in their view the fetus is not recognizably shaped like a human. The second stage, when it does have the form of a human being, but in their view life has not yet entered into it, interestingly. Cyn myned enaid yn thou is the phrase there at the beginning of that Welsh passage, before life enters it. And the final stage then is being fully alive, gwedi adel enaid yn thou. After enaid, life force, has entered into it, it's then, the child then must be paid through cwbl o alanas, all of the galanas, the fine for killing, for homicide. Roughly speaking, the lawyers identified the 3 stages with the 3 trimesters of pregnancy. So a graphic and difficult example there of the meaning of enaid, but an important and interesting one. Now, in this sense, vital force, it was not only humans who possessed anim or enaid, it belongs properly to animals as well. Irish and Welsh examples again, one from the Lives of Malasha. Tafid anim in achif, so restore my horses to life. And the Welsh example, again from a law text, dau ugain tadal enaid buch na ich. So the compensation for killing somebody's cow or ox, for the life of cow or ox, is 40 pence. And the word could also be figuratively extended, as in this phrase from a grammatical treatise. Grammar of Welsh, 14th century approximately. Canes enaid agystir y synwyr pob ymadrodd yw berf. Irish anim, Welsh enaid and Latin anima, have such similar meanings that it looks as though there's been a cultural convergence around the same Christian late antique beliefs. Christians conceived of the soul as the force that animated the body. There was a philosophical tradition that distinguished three units, body, soul, and spirit, but the main view in Western Christianity quite early on came to be that soul and spirit were one, as in this early gloss. In the Irish gloss, beochid in spirit in gorp in vechtsa. At this point, the spirit vivifies the body. Spirit is borrowing from Latin. Spiritus means breath. Modern Irish, spirit. All the Celtic languages have borrowed this word. Welsh has a spirit. All these words tell us that life, in the sense of animacy, was intimately linked to breathing. It would be hard to use anim or enaid for plants, for instance. I don't mean to say that plants were not thought to be alive. Of course, people knew that plants were alive, but the terminology of life is not often applied to them. Some people occasionally did make the parallel between life, human life and death, and plant life and death, as in this beautiful stanza from an early Welsh poem, sometime between the 9th and 12th century, a poem on old age. A ddeilen hon, nis cynired gwynt, gwai hi o'i thunged, hi hen, eleni y ganed. So the speaker, who's an old man, sees a brown leaf being blown around and compares the leaf to his own fate. It is old, but it had only 1 year of life. This brings me to the idea of life as the totality of life on Earth, its history and its development. This is a much more foreign idea to medieval literature. The ancient world and Christianity distinguished very strongly between humans and animals, and plants came a very distant third. Only human beings had souls, and immortal souls and reason. Animals were animate, they had life, but they lacked reason and morality, and plants had only a very restricted share of the attributes of the other kinds of life. Isidorus Seville feels that he has to explain that trees are alive, and why. Et arboris vitam habera dicunt, quia ginuntur crescunt, because they sprout and grow. And here's an early modern scientific tract in Irish from Latin, covering the same idea. Gach iliani nief geldfodach agawil anum fedische fals uha fein or of all lydia durin the iad. Okay. Everything that has no senses, but in which there is anim, life, can grow of its own accord because God who made them willed it. So there is an example of anim being used of plants, but I suspect this was really very rare outside of scientific or medical discourse. Now, if the living world was fractured in the medieval imagination, the opposite was true of its history. It had no history as such. People believed in a single act of creation, out of which plants and animals had arisen in one go. Life on Earth is therefore a doubly difficult idea to convey in medieval languages. The nearest concept would be creation, but that includes everything that's created. And that extends to inanimate objects like earth and rocks, indeed the entire visible and invisible universe. Early Welsh poem, 12th century religious poem here, going through the elements and the various parts of creation that praise God. Athfendicod I vascul a femin, male and female. Athfendicod I seithniau a ser, 7 days and the stars. Athfendicod I awyr ag ether, air and ether, and so on. In this tradition, the gulf between organic and inorganic parts of creation is much less than that between humankind and all other creatures. Now, in giving you this brief tour of life in the Celtic languages, I've been guilty of various crimes against philology, especially the crime of putting everything together in one big pot and stirring it up as a stew. This was a besetting sin of older Celtic studies and is very much frowned on today, I hope. We put great emphasis on the essential coordinates of time and place and the exact analysis of individual texts in their proper context. And only after that kind of painstaking work has been done can we ask big amorphous questions such as what was life for the medieval Irish? The answers will be multifarious, variable, shifting from text to text and place to place within the same text. Life is different in a penitential text from life in a heroic text. Life is one thing when it's considered the vital process. It's another thing when it means a way of conducting oneself. Some of our most important meanings for the word life are rare or not found at all in medieval Welsh and Irish, and so on. So you may be disappointed when I argue that the idea of life as the sum total of all living things and their history was marginal at best in medieval Wales and Ireland. After all, people have gone to early Irish and Welsh texts to look for this idea because it is so central to our modern thinking. In many cases, there's been an assumption, spoken or otherwise, that Celts, I use the term in inverted commas, had more sympathy with nature, that is, non-human life, than other cultures. Now, it is true you can find extraordinarily powerful descriptions of the natural world in both languages. Famous example of an early Irish nature poem, Fegadwyf, Sarfothuith, Inward Mwyth Milach, Alpha Ron, Rivach Ron, Ogov Lon Lin. There are dozens of these so-called early nature poems, and I don't in any way want to detract from their value as poetry, that they're hugely impressive and beautiful pieces of work, but they cannot sustain the weight of expectations that have been put upon them. They will not provide a philosophy of ecological living for our times. They are focused on human desires, human perceptions, and human needs. Even in this little poem, as you can see, it is framed through human need, through human eyes, by its very first line, Fegadwyf. When you make literature, you make choices. What you include, what you exclude. There's a whole book to be written on what's included and excluded in early Irish nature poetry. The poems may not refer explicitly to human emotion, but silence is not the same thing as absence. And often in Welsh, the human context is made more explicit. A little stanza from a Welsh nature poem. Yn Aberciawg ar gan gogau, ar gangau blodeuawg, gwae glafau clyw on boddawg. So we have here a speaker, a sick man, who's banished from society and is out in nature because he has no choice. And his is the voice we hear in the poem explicitly. Now, poems like these were very influential in shaping definitions of Celticity, Celticness in the early 20th century. But in recent years, they have fallen far out of sight. We have now realized they were not composed by nature-loving Celtic bards, and nor by visionary hermits living off berries and roots in the woods. They were the products of well-read and well-fed churchmen sitting at their writing desks, men whose comfortable indoor lifestyle was sustained by the labours of the peasantry who actually did have to toil in the open air. And it was a notoriously sharp piece of writing by the late Donegal Coran that really banished these materials and banished the idea of early Irish hermit poetry from the discourse. The natural world in literature is value-laden. The values are human. But to conclude now, recognizing that fact does not seem to me to be the end of dealing with it. And when I first gave this lecture, I began as follows. My last paragraph began with the idea: in the future, I suspect that the humanities in general will have to pay a lot more attention to life on Earth, as the environmental situation is expected to worsen throughout our lives. Now, of course, we've now had a recent and extraordinary reminder that human beings do not control their environment, not even through their most powerful tool of language. Workers in the humanities will need to think about how their focus on language and the construction of reality by human discourse can be reconciled with the importance of the air and water, soil, rocks, plants, and animals that actually sustain our lives. And those who understand the import of the scientific evidence will need to pay more attention to the structures of thought and expression within which human beings conduct their mental and social lives, because they very often make the communication of scientific evidence difficult. In recent weeks, we've seen just how difficult that is and how important. Some use of language has been extraordinarily effective at influencing human behavior for the better, and some has been nothing short of disastrous. Maybe eventually the need to understand the difference will bring humanities and the natural sciences closer together. Thank you.